A team from the International Monetary Fund and Senegalese government officials met from the 19th to the 26th of this month. The delegation's visit to Dakar followed a major reassessment of Senegal's debt profile. An audit commissioned by the Senegalese government, which was made public back in February, uncovered significant hidden liabilities, including unregistered loans and arrears. According to the Court of Auditors report, the debt accumulated significantly between 2019 and 2023. The findings show that Senegal's debt was much higher than the officially reported figure of 74.4% of GDP at the end of 2023, with revised data revealing it actually stood at 111% at the time and nearly 119% at the end of 2024. The IMF has called for urgent reforms in Senegal. Its delegation discussed the matter with top Senegalese government officials, including the finance and state ministers. The West African nation is now banking on a recovery plan outlined by Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko that seeks to stabilize Senegal's finances without piling on more debt.
For this recovery plan, 90% of resources are expected to come from mobilizing internal resources without debt. We will only ask external partners for the asset recycling part that I will present shortly, while maintaining ownership of these assets, or during public calls for savings in the domestic market, where residents of the zone could potentially contribute.
The recovery plan aims to cut the budget deficit from 12% to 3% of GDP by 2027. Fueled by oil and gas revenue, Senegal's economy grew by 12.1% in early 2025, but non-hydrocarbon sectors still lag behind, with the construction and chemical industries struggling.
We cannot, 65 years later, continue to wait for salvation from outside. Africa must evolve, and Senegal must evolve. Since the findings were made after the audits, the entire national debate revolved around the IMF. The IMF has not dispersed. Will we have a new program with the IMF? What we are presenting today expects almost nothing from anyone.
The IMF has welcomed Senegal's commitment to carry out necessary reforms and has expressed its readiness to support a new program aligned with Senegal's goals. But discussions on the corrective measures that need to be carried out continue before the financial misreporting case is taken before the IMF's Executive Board. Najma Abdurizak, CGTN.
Let's bring in Bright Simmons, who's a policy analyst at the Imani Center for Policy and Education, a think tank based in Ghana. He's joining us now live on the program from Accra. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So let's start with a broad outline here. Do we have any clarity on what these undisclosed debts were, the ones which were unearthed, rather, by the Mazars audit?
Yes, I mean, there are four broad categories involved here. So the first category is a group of loans that the government took, but they received the money through commercial bank accounts. So these monies did not go into the ledger. So if you were auditing the government ledger, you wouldn't have found out that they've taken these loans. So that's number one. Number two was a set of spending activities that did not go through the Treasury single account. So essentially, the government spent money. This money, because spending has an implication on the deficit has an implication on the debt. That feeds into the national debt, and that was not covered. The third is state-owned enterprises, particularly in the energy sector, like Senegal, SAR, taking loans that ultimately become liabilities of the government, but are not recorded in official government books. And then lastly are guarantees that are also typically incurred or issued on behalf of state-owned enterprises, and that when these state-owned enterprises are not able to pay, they crystallize into government debts. So these are the four main categories of debt we are talking about.
How exactly did they get away with hiding this for so long? Because, just to use the example you gave last, for example, like if you have guarantees that essentially have been issued to SOEs and then those trigger, I mean, at the very least, the finance ministry or whichever the responsible ministry is should report to legislators and make disclosures and say, we're providing this much of a guarantee to this SOE and these are the conditions under which it will trigger.
Well, it's slightly more complex than that, because sometimes what the IMF considers public debt is not what the country considers public debt. So Ghana, for instance, where I live, and where I'm having this call from, they've had a similar situation, except that in Ghana's case, it was the other direction. Ghana overstated the debt. And so Ghana's debt to GDP has actually come down, because it turns out that over a period of time, Ghana was overstating the total amount of public debt. Part of this classification problem arises because sometimes the government thinks it's using creative accounting to avoid increasing the debt, and that it can get away with it. For instance, letting an SOE issue a guarantee for payments in the energy sector is something that they do in Ghana and Nigeria as well. The problem, if you go to Nigeria, you find NNPC, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, has many of these kind of hidden debts. The problem is, when does it become the liability of the central government? It becomes the liability of the central government when the SOE, the state-owned enterprise, cannot pay. Now, that analytical judgment, that decision, to decide to report that this is likely to have become public debt is, to my mind, it's in some countries a matter of playing fast and loose.
But was it also perhaps a systemic issue in the sense that the guarantees may not have been made public in the first place? So, to use a hypothetical example, NNPC, for example, might have a guarantee from the Energy Ministry or the Finance Ministry, but that has not been disclosed to legislators or the public.
Yeah, we have some instances where, contracts that are signed by SOEs that have an implication for public debt are not properly collated and reported through the rest of the system. So that is something that happens in many other African countries as well. But it does appear that in the case of Senegal, these were substantial, which is why they are revising debt to GDP from 74% to 114% now, around 11%, currently. But it was up to 118% when these problems were started to crystallize in 2023. So it's a common problem in many African countries. The challenge in Senegal's case is that it's so substantial.
Let's talk about solutions, because there's a range of corrective measures that the IMF team that was in the country last week pointed out, including centralizing debt management. How would this work in their system, and how fast can these measures be implemented?
Well, first of all, there's a treasury single account that Senegal has committed to, which essentially says that all government spending, money coming in, money going out, there must be a single lens that gives you visibility into money coming in and money going out. And that will also help you to track debt. And of course, you have to make sure that you don't shift revenues across the years, because they were playing loose, fast and loose also with maturity. When there's a particular liability crystallized, that has to be changed. And the IMF is very clear that that process has to be done very quickly. There's also SOEs. You need to centralize the debt what that means that you look across the government, the whole of government scan, and then you say, where are the liabilities that are likely to become the problem of the central government? And you show visibility there. So part of that work has already been done through this Mazes inquiry. So the next job is really political will. But I think the new administration, because they did not cause this problem, have an unusual, commitment to get this done quickly, because they feel like, we're just doing the right thing here. It would have been much more difficult if it was the same government that caused the problem.
Indeed, it's the usual problem of finding credibility, isn't it? One last question for you. Why does Senegal need a new credit line from the IMF? What specific problem would that new loan help them solve?
Well, Senegal has a financing gap still. Remember that if they did not get additional resource from the IMF, then by the rules, they need to refund disbursements that were illegally, so to speak, or irregularly disbursed. So they've received money from the IMF. They shouldn't have received that by the IMF because they were not eligible based on their compliance with the rules. But now, because they have themselves reported, they've self-reported, the IMF is willing, obviously subject to the approval of the board, but now that there's been a staff agreement, typically the board is a formality. The IMF is willing now to let that go, to ride by. But you can only let that ride by the new resources. Because without new resources, then you are liable, or rather you are immediately liable for the disbursements that were made in the past that you were not eligible for. Secondly, given what we now know, borrowing costs for Senegal has gone up. IMF is concessional, meaning that the interest rate is pretty low. So when your borrowing costs have gone up, that's when you need the IMF. There are also some balance of payment pressures And even though notwithstanding all of this, growth is doing well, their balance of payment pressures, and all of those things typically requires an IMF injection